a wealthy elderly man was fired from his own company. Years later, he returned as a janitor, and no one imagined who he really was until he left everyone speechless. The whistle of the coffee machine filled the boardroom, but the sound seemed distant against the thick tension in the air. Robert Collins, the founder and president of Collins & Associates, stood in front of the imposing mahogany table, looking at the faces of those he once considered his second family. Men and women with whom he had worked side by side for over 30 years now stared back at him with calculating eyes and cold expressions. The room, which used to buzz with energy and enthusiasm, was now drowned in silence. "Our company has always been a pillar of integrity," Robert began, trying to keep his tone steady despite the uncomfortable atmosphere. "People trust us because they know we prioritize individuals over profit. Every decision we make doesn't just impact our bottom line, but also the community we serve." The murmurs around the table grew louder. From the far end, Alexander Blake, his lifelong partner and now chief operating officer, leaned back in his chair with a barely visible smirk. With his dark hair and immaculate suit, Alexander exuded a confidence bordering on arrogance. His eyes glinted maliciously as he watched Robert, fully aware of what was about to unfold. "With all due respect, Robert," Alexander interrupted, "that vision sounds outdated. Today, what companies need is not just ethics, but aggression and adaptability. And frankly, I'm worried that our company is falling behind." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Robert looked at each board member. All were men and women he had personally recruited. He had been a mentor to many of them, watched them grow and develop. And now, these same people nodded at Alexander's words as if they were the tolls of a bell signaling his doom. "Falling behind?" Robert repeated, disbelief in his voice. "Alexander, what are you talking about? We've exceeded our targets for the past 5 consecutive years. We're stronger than ever." Alexander rose slowly, and with the calm of a predator, slid a dossier across the table. The other executives leaned forward to examine the pages, filled with figures and charts Robert didn't recognize. Alexander looked directly into his eyes. "Mr. Collins, the truth is our profit margins have been drastically reduced due to your responsible spending policies." He spat out the words as if they were poison. "We're missing out on million-dollar opportunities because you insist on protecting employees who don't generate a substantial return." Robert felt a knot forming in his stomach. He leaned closer to look at the documents, but Alexander continued speaking, his words falling like sharp blades. "Look at these numbers," Alexander said, pointing to a graph showing an apparent drop in profits. "Why are we maintaining entire departments that are unproductive? Why do we keep investing in social programs that offer no tangible benefits? Robert, this isn't a charity. It's a business." The executives' faces grew more serious. Robert felt his world begin to crumble. It was clear that Alexander had prepared this ambush meticulously. But why now? Why, after so many years of trust and teamwork? "This can't be right. These figures must be—" Robert tried to argue, but Alexander cut him off again with a disdainful sneer. "They are entirely accurate." Alexander shot a glance at William Suarez, the young CFO seated to his right. William nodded silently and pulled out a projector, starting to display slides with more alarming charts and projections. "Robert, we can't keep ignoring this," William said softly, almost reverently, but with a firmness that took Robert by surprise. "We need to make drastic changes if we want to survive in this market." Robert stepped back, searching the room for support. His eyes landed on John Perez, his friend and co-founder, sitting in the corner. John had been his greatest ally all these years, his right hand. But now, John stared blankly at the table, hands trembling as he clutched the papers before him. "John, you know what we've built," Robert whispered, his voice trembling. "You stood by me when we decided this company would be different. Don't you remember?" The silence was devastating. John swallowed, lifted his gaze briefly, and then lowered it again, unable to meet the eyes of his longtime friend. Robert understood immediately. John was trapped, under pressure, or had simply yielded to Alexander's power. "I can't go on like this," John finally said, in a barely audible tone. Then, with a sigh that seemed to drain all the strength from his body, he raised his hand in approval. Robert's heart sank. No, this couldn't be happening. Not like this. Not here. Not with the men and women he had taught to be more than mere employees. But one by one, every board member raised their hands, nodding slowly with Alexander. Alexander's voice rang out like a gavel, sealing his fate. "By unanimous vote, the board has decided that your leadership has come to an end, Mr. Collins. You are requested to sign these documents and resign as the president of Collins and Associates, effective immediately." Robert stared at the papers in disbelief. It was as if the ground was collapsing beneath his feet. With trembling hands, he took the pen Alexander offered him. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Signing these papers would mean losing everything: his company, his legacy, his dignity. "This isn't the end, Alexander," Robert murmured, locking eyes with his former partner. "The company is more than numbers on a spreadsheet. It's bigger than you and me." But Alexander only smiled. That cold smile Robert had never seen before. "We'll see, old friend. We'll see." With a final stroke, Robert signed. And in that moment, he knew he had lost something far greater than just a company. But he also felt it wouldn't be for long. Robert Collins left the room with his head held high, but his soul shattered. Outside, the hallways that once buzzed with the spirit of collaboration and camaraderie now seemed cold and empty. Employees who used to greet him with respect now avoided his gaze, and when he finally reached the main lobby, there stood Elena. "Dad," she said, a mix of disappointment and pain in her eyes. "Elena, I don't want to hear it, Dad. How could you risk the company like this?" Her voice was a dagger to his heart. "You've let everyone down, and you've let me down." And with those words, Elena turned and walked out of the building, leaving Robert completely alone. No allies, no family, nothing. But inside, something began to ignite. This wasn't over. Alexander wouldn't get away with it, not while he was still breathing. The echo of Robert's footsteps rang through the stairwell of the run-down building, marking the rhythm of his personal downfall. It had been 3 months since he was ousted from the company, and yet every day he woke up with the same feeling of disbelief, as if it were all a bad dream. But it wasn't. The reality was harsher than any nightmare. His company no longer belonged to him, his reputation was in tatters, and his relationship with his daughter Elena was shattered beyond repair. Robert pushed open the heavy wooden door of his modest apartment. It was a small space, stripped of all luxury. The bare white walls stood in stark contrast to the grandeur that once surrounded him. A man who had lived in mansions and led an empire now found himself confined to a tiny corner of the city, cut off from everything he had ever loved. His only companion was an old radio that he kept on just to feel less alone. He sat on his worn-out sofa, staring blankly at the floor. In his mind, the voices of his former partners still echoed, outdated, obsolete, a hindrance to growth. His hands trembled as he remembered the empty look in John's eyes, his most loyal friend, who hadn't had the courage to defend him. How could anyone rebuild after a betrayal like that? "Maybe it's time to accept that I no longer belong in this world," he whispered to himself, feeling the weight of his years crush him. Then the doorbell rang, snapping him out of his dark thoughts. Robert frowned. He wasn't expecting any visitors. When he opened the door, he found a face he hadn't seen in a long time. Andres, a former employee who had worked with him since the early days of the company. A simple man, marked by hard work and an unwavering loyalty that Robert had always admired in his oldest employees. "Mr. Collins," Andres said, bowing his head slightly, as if he were still standing before his boss. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I needed to see you." Robert stepped aside and invited him in. It was the first visit he'd received since his downfall, and something in Andres's troubled expression made him realize this wasn't a simple courtesy call. "Andres, what brings you here?" Robert asked, trying to sound welcoming, though bitterness seeped into his voice. Andres sat across from him, looking around the small apartment with a painful recognition of how much things had changed. He pulled out a crumpled folder from his bag and handed it to Robert with trembling hands. "Sir, everyone at the company, well, those of us who are still left, want you to know what's happening. Alexander and William have fired half of the original staff. They're selling our patents and technologies to foreign companies for a fraction of their true value. They're destroying everything you built." Robert opened the folder and found altered financial reports, mass layoffs, and a list of assets that used to be the exclusive property of Collins and Associates. As he read, his hands began to tremble again, but this time it wasn't from sadness. It was from a deep, simmering anger he had tried to bury. "This can't be," he murmured. They're pillaging the company. It's not just about control. They want to wipe it out completely." Andres nodded grimly. "Many of us have tried to speak up, but William has HR under his thumb. Anyone who questions anything is fired on the spot. The few of us still hanging on are just trying to protect what little remains. But we're running out of strength. We need someone to do something. We need someone who knows the company like you, Mr. Collins." Robert closed his eyes. Andres's words echoed his own thoughts. But what could he do? What could an old man, stripped of all power and support, really do? "I can't go back," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "Alexander made sure I have no legal rights to intervene. And after what happened, who would listen to me? To everyone, I'm just a stubborn old man who couldn't adapt to modern times." Andres gritted his teeth and slammed his fist on the table, startling Robert. "Don't say that. You're not just any man. You're Robert Collins, the real founder of that company, the man who taught us to work with integrity and believe in a better future. Without you, they've already won. And I can't stand by and watch Alexander destroy everything you built. At least, not without a fight." Andres's words pierced through Robert like a spear. He stood up and began to pace, feeling a fire burn within him. He couldn't return as the president. He couldn't confront Alexander on his own turf. But there was another way. He could enter from the shadows, observe everything that was happening, and strike when they least expected it. "If I return, it can't be as Robert Collins," he said slowly, looking at Andres with renewed determination. "I'll come back as someone else. Someone no one would look at twice. Someone who can see what's happening in every corner and gather evidence without raising suspicion." Andres frowned, but as the idea took shape in his mind, his eyes lit up. "You mean—" "Yes," Robert said firmly. "I need to disappear. I need to become a ghost, an invisible man. And to do that, I must transform myself into someone completely different." The old man walked over to his closet and pulled out a set of old clothes he had kept for sentimental reasons, a loose shirt, baggy trousers, and a pair of worn-out boots. He looked at himself in the mirror, allowing the image of the once powerful businessman to fade away. "From now on," he murmured, "my name will be Javier. And no one, absolutely no one, must know who I really am." Andres watched him with respect and a newfound spark of hope in his eyes. "What do you want me to do, sir?" Robert smiled for the first time in months, a small smile, but one filled with determination. "I want you to go back to the company and keep a low profile. I'll enter as a simple janitor, and from the inside, we'll assess the true extent of the damage. Alexander thinks he's already destroyed me, but what he doesn't realize is that sometimes it's the silence of an invisible man that is most terrifying." And so, that night, Robert burned the last photos and documents that tied him to his former life, erasing every trace of Robert Collins. The man who walked out of the apartment the next morning was not a fallen businessman, but a simple janitor with a cap covering part of his face and a hunched posture. Javier, he thought to himself, adjusting his worn hat as he stepped into the cold morning. He made his way toward Collins and Associates, the place where he had built his empire, ready to wage a secret war from within. What Alexander didn't know was that he had awakened a sleeping lion, and this lion had returned with a silent roar that would soon shake the very foundations of the company. The cold morning air wrapped around the imposing building of Collins and Associates. The glass and steel tower rose like a colossus, a symbol of success and power. But for Robert Collins, now known as Javier, this building was more than just a structure. It was the reflection of a dream that had been stolen and distorted. He gazed at the main entrance from across the street, feeling a bitter knot of emotion tighten in his throat. This was the first day of his new life, an invisible janitor, an unnoticed spectator. He adjusted his faded cap and, with his head down, crossed the street. He merged with the stream of employees arriving early to their posts, most of them too absorbed in their own thoughts to notice the hunched old man with a cleaning cart. Upon reaching the main entrance, the security guards didn't even lift their eyes from their phones. Perfect, Robert thought, just as I planned. He entered the lobby and headed to the small side door marked Maintenance Personnel. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The buzz of fluorescent lights and the sound of water pipes echoed in the narrow hallway. He was greeted by the smell of disinfectant and the sight of a group of janitors gathered around a small table, some sipping coffee and others sitting quietly. "You must be the new guy," a rough voice interrupted. Robert looked up to see a sturdy woman with brown hair tied in a tight bun. She wore a grey vest and had a stern look, but her eyes sparkled with a hint of hidden kindness. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Javier," Robert replied humbly, adopting the voice of a man with no pretense or pride. "I'm Linda, the supervisor of the cleaning team," she said, crossing her arms as she sized him up. "This job isn't easy. You'll be staying late, cleaning up after others, trash, documents, and sometimes worse." She paused, waiting for any sign of hesitation from him, but Robert remained silent, eyes cast down. "There's only one rule here, Javier. Stay out of everyone's business. You didn't see anything, and you didn't hear anything. Understood?" Robert nodded slowly, never lifting his gaze. "Perfectly understood, ma'am." Linda sighed, and although she still seemed wary, she relaxed a little. "Good. You'll be in charge of the 7th floor. That's where the administration and accounting offices are. I don't want any trouble, got it? The last cleaner we had asked too many questions and, well, he's no longer here." "I understand. I won't cause any trouble," Robert replied calmly, a shiver running down his spine as he wondered about the fate of the previous janitor. Linda led him to a small storage room filled with cleaning supplies, mops, buckets, detergents, and maintenance uniforms. The old man donned the yellow fluorescent vest that marked him as a temporary cleaner and took hold of the cart Linda indicated. It felt heavy and creaky under his hands, but he pushed it with resolve. The 7th floor, he thought. It was a critical area, the place where many of the company's financial documents and contracts were handled. There, under the guise of monotony and silence, real power shifted. Alexander had changed the organizational chart, merging departments and creating new structures to consolidate his control. But corruption, if it existed, always left traces, and Robert intended to find them. The elevator ascended slowly, marking each floor with a metallic tone. When the doors opened on the 7th floor, he was met by a very different atmosphere from the modest maintenance room. The polished marble floors reflected the bright lights, and the walls were adorned with modern paintings representing the opulence and success the company once projected. Robert pushed his cart through the deserted corridors, observing everything with the eyes of a janitor, but the mind of a strategist. The silence of the early morning allowed him to roam the area unnoticed. As he cleaned the desks, he noticed many documents left out, unsupervised. Financial reports, projections. But he couldn't linger too long. He needed to move cautiously, without raising suspicion. A sudden noise startled him. He hid behind a column, watching. A shadow appeared at the end of the hallway. It was a tall, thin man with a stern expression. Robert recognized him instantly. William Suarez, the company's financial director. He had been just a boy when Robert first hired him, the same boy he had guided and supported. Now he had become Alexander's enforcer, a calculating and cold traitor. William was reviewing a set of folders, frowning as he muttered to himself. Unaware that Robert was watching, the young man entered a side office and closed the door. The plaque on the door read, "Chief Financial Officer's Office." Robert waited until the sound of footsteps faded before approaching. With a quick motion, he opened the cleaning closet and grabbed a small damp cloth. Pretending to clean the door handle, he took a closer look at the lock. Electronic lock with restricted access, he thought. William was hiding something in there, something important. But he couldn't be so obvious as to force his way in. He retreated cautiously, returning to his duties. The danger was real, and every misstep could expose him. He finished his round on the 7th floor without further incident and returned to the maintenance area before the shift change. At 7 a.m., employees began arriving, and the directors gathered to plan the day. It had only been his first day, and he already had a certainty. Something very dark was brewing on the 7th floor. Weeks later, Robert had perfected his routine. He moved through the company floors like a ghost, always with his head down, always invisible. His eyes scanned every corner, every conversation, every expression. He uncovered patterns in William and Alexander's movements. There were days when they mysteriously disappeared from the usual meetings and locked themselves in the main office. More importantly, he began noticing the subtle signs of discontent among the lower-level employees. The atmosphere was thick with tension and fear. Many moved as if walking on shattered glass, afraid that one wrong word would put them in Alexander's crosshairs. Whispers of blacklists, sudden dismissals, and increased pressure to meet nearly impossible targets circulated quietly through the hallways. But the most unsettling revelation came one afternoon when Robert, while cleaning the Human Resources office, stumbled upon a termination report that shouldn't have been there. It was for an employee named Patricia Morales. He remembered Patricia, a bright, passionate young woman who had worked on community development projects. The report cited incompetence and misconduct, but Robert knew it was a cover-up. Something had happened. The next day, he tried to ask subtle questions to the other cleaners, but most shrugged, except for one, a timid young man named Carlos Mendoza. She tried to report William, Carlos whispered, glancing around nervously to make sure no one was listening. She said he was harassing her, but no one believed her. And now she's fired, and no one knows where she is. That was the spark that ignited Robert's fire. The altered figures, the mass layoffs, Alexander's absolute control. It all pointed to a deeper level of corruption and abuse than he had ever imagined. "And what do you plan to do about it?" Carlos asked, his eyes filled with desperate hope. Robert stared at him, choosing his words carefully. Carlos was young, passionate, and above all, willing to fight, but he was also vulnerable. "For now, nothing," Robert replied firmly. "But if we're patient and careful, we can do something much bigger." Carlos looked confused and frustrated, but eventually nodded. From that day on, he became a silent ally. Robert was no longer alone in this battle. He had found a young man with the same thirst for justice and the same anger he felt. "Alexander, you didn't see me coming," Robert thought as he pushed the cleaning cart toward the exit at the end of his shift. "But I assure you, I'm going to destroy everything you've built. From the shadows, I'm going to drag you into the light." This was just the beginning. The clock struck 2 in the morning, and silence reigned in the building of Collins and Associates. The only light came from the flickering screens of security monitors and the emergency lamps casting long shadows in the empty corridors. As Robert, now known as Javier, pushed his cleaning cart down the 7th floor hallway, His eyes moved with surgical precision. He had learned to read the flow of the company, which hallways were safe, which offices were occupied at certain hours, and, most importantly, where the blind spots were that the security guards never monitored. That night, fate brought him in front of Laura Fernandez's office, the head of human resources. A wooden door with her name engraved on a golden plaque. Robert, with his calm, methodical movements, began wiping the area with a damp cloth, waiting for the camera to turn and leave him out of its line of sight. He knew he had less than 30 seconds before the camera swung back to its original position. He had been studying the security patterns for weeks and knew every second of the routine. Quickly, he slipped his hand into his uniform pocket and pulled out a copy of the key Carlos, the young logistics employee, had managed to obtain for him. The door opened silently. He slipped inside and closed it behind him, holding his breath. His heart pounded as he crouched behind Laura's desk. He had to find something, anything that could tell him where she stood in relation to Alexander and William. In recent days, he had overheard snippets of conversations between William and Alexander, mentioning Laura with a tone of distrust. Could it be that she, too, was on the brink of being dismissed? He began scanning through the files, moving swiftly. He found folders with information on dismissed employees, documents with signatures that didn't quite match, and in the back, a sealed envelope labeled "Confidential, for Laura Fernandez only." His hand trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was an anonymous letter addressed to Laura with a clear message. "If you choose to protect Robert Collins, they will destroy you. Stay silent if you want to keep your life and your career." Alongside the letter was a small list of employees' names, including Carlos Mendoza, under a header that read, "Rebellion Risk." "Damn it," Robert whispered. Alexander wasn't just manipulating the executives, he also had a firm grip on human resources. Laura was under surveillance. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps outside made him freeze. He quickly put everything back in place, closed the envelope, and slid out of the office with fluid movements. Just as the security guard rounded the corner, Robert straightened up, the damp cloth in his hand, nonchalantly wiping the door handle. The guard eyed him suspiciously. "What are you doing here at this hour?" the man asked, crossing his arms over his chest. Robert looked up slowly, adopting the hunched posture and submissive gaze of an unnoticed worker. "Supervisor Linda said they needed this area cleaned before tomorrow's meeting," he replied in a dull voice. "Just doing my job, sir." The guard frowned but finally nodded and walked away. "Stay out of trouble, old man," he muttered as he continued down the hall. Robert let out a breath of relief as the guard disappeared from sight. He straightened up slowly and left the 7th floor, knowing that he needed to talk to Laura that very night. The next morning, Laura Fernandez's office was filled with anxious employees seeking answers about the wave of layoffs and the changes in the company's structure. From his discreet corner in the cleaning area, Robert watched the chaos as he meticulously swept the floor. But his eyes were fixed on Laura, who moved around, trying to calm the employees. There was a weariness in her gaze, a shadow of fear that hadn't been there before. When the last employee finally left and the door closed, Robert slipped into her office without being noticed. Laura stiffened the moment she saw him. "Who are you?" she whispered, eyes wide with alarm. "What are you doing here?" Robert shut the door behind him and took off his cap, revealing his aged face, but with an intensity still burning in his eyes. "Laura, it's me, Robert Collins." Laura stepped back, her face instantly going pale. No, it can't be." She took another step back, glancing around as if searching for an escape. You were ousted months ago. You shouldn't be here." "I know," Robert replied, keeping his voice low but steady. "And believe me, I'm not here to harm you. I'm here to uncover what Alexander and William are doing to my company. And I need to know if you're willing to help me." Laura's eyes filled with panic, and her hands started to tremble. She pulled out the letter he had found the night before and tossed it onto the desk. Is this what you want?" Her voice shook with restrained fury. "Do you know what this means? If they find out I've been helping someone like you, I'll lose everything. My career, my life, everything." Robert looked at the letter silently and then raised his gaze. "I know, but you know better than anyone what they're doing to the company. The employees are terrified. Patricia was fired for speaking out against William, and now even those who remain are being watched. Do you really want to keep being part of this?" Laura stared at him, tears welling up in her eyes. The internal struggle was clear on her face. For years, she had fought to maintain the integrity of the Human Resources Department, protecting the employees as best she could. But with Alexander and William in control, every day felt like a losing battle. "I can't do this alone," she finally murmured. "I can't fight them. They've made me fire my own friends." Tears began to run down her cheeks. "I don't know who to trust anymore." "Then trust me," Robert said softly. "I'm not asking you to risk everything right away. All I need is for you to watch. Listen, if you find something that can help us, leave it in the maintenance room, behind the shelves. No one would suspect a janitor of having access to confidential documents." Laura looked at him intently, as if trying to read his soul. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "Okay, but if this goes wrong, if anyone suspects me—" "I won't let anything happen to you," Robert promised, with a sincerity that startled Laura. "I can't promise there won't be danger, but I swear, if we work together, we can bring them down. And when all this is over, you'll have the position in the company you once dreamed of." Laura nodded, wiping away her tears. She had taken a step toward the edge of a cliff, and she knew it. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. "All right, Javier," she said, using his false name with a tone of respect for the first time. "But if we're going to do this, you should know Alexander is already more paranoid than you think. He's planning something big, something that will make the entire world see Collins and Associates as an unrecognizable company." Robert narrowed his eyes. "What kind of plan?" "I don't know yet, but William has been secretly negotiating with foreign companies. Something about selling our patents and the rights to our projects to competitors for ridiculous prices. Alexander plans to sell everything and leave with the money. If that happens, this company will die. Forever." The silence that followed was heavy, but in that darkness, Robert felt the pieces finally starting to fall into place. "Then we need to act fast," Robert said firmly. "But at least now, I'm not alone." Laura looked into his eyes and for the first time nodded with determination. "No, now there are two of us, and I'm ready to fight." Robert nodded and put his cap back on, hiding his face once more. "I'll see you in the shadows, Laura." And so, that night, Robert Collins, the man who had turned into a ghost, gained his first real ally inside the company's upper ranks. The resistance had begun. The lights on the 10th floor of Collins and Associates remained on long after nightfall. The building, which had once buzzed with energy and enthusiasm, now felt like a glass prison. Robert Collins, or rather, Javier, moved his cleaning cart slowly, maintaining his hunched posture and downcast gaze as he approached the executive office area. Tonight, his objective was clear: to keep an eye on John Perez. John, Robert's former friend and partner, had been the only one to show any remorse when Robert was ousted. But in the last few months, something had changed in him. He had started aligning too closely with Alexander and William, approving decisions that went against everything he once stood for. Robert needed to understand why. What had driven John to betray him like this? And more importantly, how could he bring him back? He stopped in a dark corner of the hallway and looked toward John's office. Through the frosted glass, he could see his old friend hunched over his desk, his hands covering his face. He looked exhausted, defeated. Robert took a moment to remember the man John had once been, a loyal partner, a dear friend who shared his vision of an ethical, committed company. But now, that man had turned into someone unrecognizable. If I can get through to John, I can change the game, Robert thought. But to do so, he needed to approach carefully, without letting Alexander suspect a thing. He waited until the hallway was completely empty and slowly approached John's office door. He knocked softly, knowing that at this hour, no one else would be around. Who is it?" asked a weak voice from inside. "A friend," Robert replied quietly, trying to infuse the words with the nostalgia of their old camaraderie. The door opened a crack, and John appeared on the other side. His eyes widened when he saw Robert, disguised as a cleaner, but before he could react, Robert gently pushed the door and stepped inside, closing it behind him. "Robert, what are you—" John stepped back, visibly nervous. He looked around as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "You can't be here. If anyone sees you—" "Relax, John. No one will see me." Robert moved slowly, keeping his hands visible in a gesture of peace. "I just want to talk. Just you and me, like we used to. Do you remember?" John let out a bitter laugh and shook his head. "Talk, huh? Talk about what? About how Alexander kicked you out of the company we built together? About how I betrayed you? Is that what you want to hear?" Robert remained silent, studying every nuance in John's expression. There was deep pain, a guilt that weighed on his words. But there was something else. Fear. A fear so palpable that Robert could almost smell it in the air. "I didn't come to judge you, John," he said softly. "I want to understand. Tell me what happened. What did Alexander do to force you into this?" His eyes searched his friends. "Where's the man who believed in this company as much as I did?" John looked away and collapsed into his chair as if all the strength had drained from him. "You have no idea what's happened, Robert," he murmured, running a trembling hand over his face. "Alexander, he knows things about me. Things that—" He took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaky voice. "If I hadn't supported him in the vote to remove you, he would have destroyed my life." "What things, John?" Robert pressed, leaning closer. "What could be so terrible that it made you betray everything you stood for?" John shuddered, but finally met Robert's gaze, desperation in his eyes. "My debts, Robert. Years ago, when I tried to save my brother's business, I took out a huge loan from a lender who turned out to be, well, dangerous. I couldn't pay it back, and—" His voice broke. "Alexander found out, and he used that information to threaten me. He said if I didn't side with him, he'd make the debt public, implying I embezzled company funds to pay it off. He'd ruin me, my family, everyone." The pain in John's eyes was genuine. Robert felt a mix of anger and compassion for his old friend. "You could have come to me, John. We could have faced this together." "No," John shook his head, defeated. "You don't understand. If I didn't comply, he threatened to go after Beatrice, my wife." He whispered the last words with a trembling voice. "Fire her, discredit her, destroy her career. He left me no choice." A heavy silence fell over the office. Robert felt a stab of pain for what his friend had endured. Now he understood why John had raised his hand that day, voting for his removal. It wasn't out of cowardice, it was out of desperation. Alexander had tightened his grip until John had no choice but to surrender. "John, you have to stop playing his game," Robert said firmly. "Alexander is destroying the company. He's selling our patents, diverting funds. If we don't act, there will be nothing left of what we built." John looked at him, his eyes brimming with tears. "And what can I do? I'm just a pawn. He controls everything. If I take one wrong step, he'll crush me. He'll fire me and ruin Beatrice." Robert leaned forward, his eyes blazing with fierce determination. "Not if we bring him down first. Not if we show everyone what he really is. But for that, I need you, John. I need you to be the man you used to be. The man who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. Because if you don't fight now, Alexander will have won forever. John turned away, struggling internally. The conflict was clear on his face, fear for his wife and the weight of betrayal. Finally, he took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "Okay. What do you need me to do?" Robert smiled sadly and placed a firm hand on John's shoulder. "I need you to keep being his eyes and ears, but this time, for us. Tell me what they're planning, when and where, and when the time comes, you'll need to be ready to expose everything." John nodded weakly, but there was a glimmer of resolve in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he seemed to have a purpose, even if it was tinged with pain. "Robert," he said, looking up, "if this goes wrong, he'll destroy me. Not just me, but Beatrice too. I can't do this alone." Robert straightened up, looking his old friend in the eye with a firmness he hadn't felt in months. "You're not alone, John. You never were. We'll fight together, and this time, we won't lose." With a final handshake, Robert slipped out of John's office, leaving his friend in the dim light. Now he had a new ally, someone who knew Alexander's inner workings and could provide the information he needed. But he also knew that each day John continued playing the role of Alexander's loyal pawn, the risk of being discovered grew. "I'll bring you back, my friend," Robert thought as he returned to his small maintenance room. "I'll pull you out of this darkness, and together we'll reclaim what's ours." Because the battle for Collins and Associates wasn't just a matter of business, it was a matter of redemption. The atmosphere on the ground floor of Collins and Associates was heavy and oppressive. It had been just over a week since his alliance with John Perez, but for Robert, time seemed to move at an exasperatingly slow pace. The building's silence at night, interrupted only by the hum of the fluorescent lights, was the perfect setting for his secret war. He had grown accustomed to moving like a shadow, gathering snippets of conversations, copying confidential documents, and maintaining contact with John and Laura through coded messages. But tonight, something felt off. As he reviewed the shift schedules in the small maintenance room, Linda, the cleaning crew supervisor, appeared with a deep frown and her lips pressed into a thin line of worry. "Javier," she said, using Robert's false name, "you need to be extra careful today. They're looking for someone in human resources. William is paranoid and has ordered a full review of all the cleaning staff's camera footage and logs." A chill ran down Robert's spine. If William was checking the cameras, it wouldn't be long before they started suspecting him or Laura. "Do you know what they're looking for?" he asked calmly, trying to keep his composure. Linda stared at him, as if weighing whether she could trust him. Then, with a sigh, she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "They said someone's been sneaking into the offices after hours. They have evidence that documents have been tampered with, and not just that. There's certain human resources is involved. Alexander is furious. They're hunting a traitor." Robert's heart skipped a beat. If William suspected Laura, it was only a matter of time before the truth was uncovered. And if she fell, all the efforts to reclaim the company would be in vain. "Thank you, Linda." He nodded slowly. "I'll be careful." Linda watched him for a moment longer, and genuine concern flickered in her eyes. "I don't know why, but I feel like you're different, Javier." She paused, hesitating. "Just be safe." Robert nodded, guilt gnawing at him for lying to her. Despite her strict demeanor, Linda had always treated him with respect, but there was no time for sentimentality. He slipped out of the maintenance room and took the elevator to the 7th floor, where he knew Laura would be working late. When he arrived at the human resources area, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Laura was alone in her office, her hands shaking as she tried to delete files on her computer. Robert's eyes widened as he watched her frantically empty folder after folder. "What are you doing?" he asked, rushing in and closing the door behind him. "They found us," Laura whispered, her face pale and gaunt. "William is going through all access logs from the past few weeks. He knows someone's been copying documents and I've been too careless. If I don't erase this evidence, they'll catch me." Robert glanced at the screen. The files Laura was trying to delete contained crucial information they needed to expose Alexander and William. They couldn't afford to lose it. But if she didn't delete them, Laura would be the first to fall. "Don't delete them," he said quietly but firmly. "Those documents are the only proof we have. If you destroy them, they win." "And if I don't, then what?" Laura looked at him with tear-filled eyes, her voice trembling with fear. "They'll fire me, Robert. They'll ruin me. My career, my life. It will all be over." "I know," Robert murmured, stepping closer. "But listen, you're not alone in this. I'm with you. John is on our side now too. We have to be smarter than they are. If you erase those files, Alexander and William will know someone here is scared, and then they won't stop until they find you." Laura froze, her hands hovering over the keyboard, visibly shaking. Then she took a deep breath and stepped away from the computer, letting out a shuddering sigh. "What do you suggest then?" Robert thought quickly. If they couldn't delete the files, they'd have to make them invisible. "Transfer them to an external drive, something small you can hide. Then erase the access logs from the network. When they check the records, it'll look like the files disappeared due to an error. William will think it was a system glitch." Laura nodded and began working quickly, copying the files onto a small USB drive. When she finished, she handed it to him with trembling hands. "Here, take it. Hide it. I can't keep it. If they find it on me, I'm done." Robert took the USB and tucked it inside his shirt, in the small pocket he had sewn specifically for this purpose. "Good. Now." He froze as he saw the hallway light flicker on and heard the sound of security guards' footsteps approaching. "Oh no!" Laura gasped, whispering frantically. "They're here! Quickly, hide!" Robert glanced around, searching for a hiding spot. But there wasn't time. In one swift movement, he ducked behind Laura's desk, just as the door swung open with a heavy thud. "Miss Fernandez," William said as he entered, flanked by 2 security guards on either side. "What a surprise to find you here at this hour. What are you doing?" Laura turned in her chair slowly, trying to compose her face. "William, I was just going through some personnel files. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to get ahead on some work." William narrowed his eyes, as if trying to peer into her soul. Then he glanced around the office, his gaze lingering briefly on the desk. "You're not trying to get rid of something, are you?" he asked softly, a dangerous edge in his voice. "What? No. Why would I do that?" The guards began moving around the office, checking cabinets and drawers. One of them leaned down near the desk, right where Robert was hiding. Robert's heart pounded as the guard nudged the chair aside. "There's nothing here," the guard said with a disappointed frown. "Transfer them to an external hard drive, something small that you can hide. Then erase the access routes on the network. When they check the logs, it will look like the files disappeared due to a technical glitch. William will think it's a system error." Laura nodded and moved quickly, copying the files onto a small USB stick. When she finished, she handed it to him with trembling hands. "Here, take it. Hide it. I can't keep it. If they find it on me, I'm done." Robert took the USB and tucked it inside his shirt, in a hidden pocket he had sewn just for this purpose. "All right, now—" He stopped as he noticed the hallway light turning on and heard the sound of security guards approaching. "Oh no!" Laura gasped, whispering frantically. "They're here! Quick, hide!" Robert looked around, desperately searching for a place to hide. But there was no time. In one swift motion, he crouched down behind Laura's desk, just as the door swung open with a loud bang. "Miss Fernandez," William said, entering with 2 security guards on either side. "What a surprise to find you here at this hour. What are you doing?" Laura turned in her chair slowly, trying to keep her face composed. "William, I was just going over some personnel files. I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd get ahead on some work. William's eyes narrowed, as if trying to read her thoughts. He glanced around the office, his gaze lingering on the desk for a moment. "You're not trying to get rid of something, are you?" he asked softly, a dangerous tone lacing his voice. "What? No. Why would I do that?" The guards began moving around the office, checking cabinets and drawers. One of them leaned down near the desk, right where Robert was hiding. Robert's heart pounded as the guard shifted the chair aside. "There's nothing here," the guard muttered, looking disappointed. William frowned. "It's strange, Laura. We've had some incidents in the company lately. Files disappearing, leaked emails." He leaned in closer, his gaze piercing into hers. "And you're one of the few people with access to the entire network." Laura swallowed hard, but didn't break eye contact. "I don't know what you're talking about, William. I'm just doing my job." William studied her for another long moment and then straightened up. "I hope that's true, Laura. Because if I find out you've been playing against me, I'll make sure you regret it." He smiled, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "Until tomorrow." With a wave, he exited the office, the guards following close behind. The door clicked shut, and silence fell over the room once more. Robert slowly stood up, his entire body trembling with adrenaline. "That was close," Laura murmured, exhaling shakily and leaning back in her chair. "You handled it well," Robert said firmly. "But we have to be more careful now. They know something's up, but they don't have solid proof yet. From now on, we move quietly. John will inform us if William takes any more actions." Laura nodded slowly, catching her breath. "Robert, thank you. Thank you for not letting me fall." "Thank you for being brave," he replied with a small smile. "This is just the beginning. But with every day that passes, Alexander and William are one step closer to making a fatal mistake." Laura took a deep breath and stood up straighter, a renewed determination shining in her eyes. "Then let's start. And this time, let's make sure they don't win." Robert left Laura's office, knowing that the tension between their small group of allies and Alexander's regime was about to reach a breaking point. But that night, Laura had stepped forward. And when the final battle came, it wouldn't just be a janitor and an HR director facing the traitors. It would be the true defenders of Collins and Associates. The golden hues of dusk painted the city's tall buildings, casting long shadows over the park where Robert waited, hidden among the branches of an old oak tree. The park was almost empty at this hour. The wooden benches stood desolate, and only a few distant murmurs of people hurrying home could be heard. Yet he knew he had to be here. Elena had agreed to meet him, and that in itself was a miracle. He had spent days planning this encounter. It was Laura who, after receiving multiple anonymous emails and encrypted reports, managed to reach out to Elena without raising suspicion. But the biggest hurdle had been his daughter's distrust, the icy distance that hadn't thawed since Robert's ousting. Despite this, Laura had convinced Elena to meet. Now, Robert stood there, holding his breath and feeling his heart pound. The sound of heels clicking on the pavement echoed nearby. Robert looked up and saw her, his daughter, wrapped in an elegant grey coat, with a wine-coloured scarf billowing in the evening breeze. Elena had always projected a quiet strength, a blend of pride and composure that made her stand out anywhere. But as she approached, he noticed the guarded look in her eyes and the stiffness in her movements. He rose slowly and stepped forward, maintaining a respectful distance. "Elena," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion and fear. She stopped a few meters away, crossing her arms over her chest like a physical barrier. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, stared at him coldly. "I don't have much time, Dad," she said curtly. "What's so important that you couldn't tell me over the phone?" Robert took a deep breath, feeling his heart hammering against his ribs. This moment was crucial, more important than any move he'd made in the past months. If he couldn't get her to listen, everything he had fought to rebuild would crumble. "I know you think I failed you," he began softly. "That I was a coward for letting Alexander push me out of the company. But what you don't know is the truth about what's happening. Alexander and William didn't just oust me. They're destroying everything we worked for. They're selling the company off piece by piece, firing the people I helped train, and now they're using dirty tactics to eliminate any opposition. I need you to listen, Elena. I need you to know this isn't just about revenge." "And what makes you think I should believe you?" Elena shot back, bitterness lacing her voice. "All my life I looked up to you, Dad. I thought you were a man of principles, someone who valued truth and justice. But after that scandal with the infrastructure project, everything fell apart. Do you know what it meant for me to see everyone calling you incompetent? To watch the press tear you apart, saying you'd lost your mind?" Robert closed his eyes, feeling the pain in every word she spoke. "I know," he said brokenly. "I know I failed you. I couldn't defend myself because Alexander set me up. He sabotaged the project from the inside and manipulated the evidence to make it look like it was all my fault. But I didn't realize it until it was too late. I thought I could fix it, and in the end, I was the one who fell." Elena stared at him, scrutinizing every line of his face, as if trying to see beyond the words. "And now, what do you want from me? Do you want me to forget everything that happened?" she asked sarcastically. "To help you get back the company you lost because of your own mistakes?" "No," Robert said firmly. "This isn't about getting the company back for me. It's about saving it from them. Alexander and William won't stop until Collins and Associates is just an empty shell, something they can sell off and destroy. There will be nothing left of the legacy we built, and the people who dedicated their lives to this place will be the first to suffer." "And what can I do?" Elena asked, her tone softening slightly. "I'm just a lawyer. I have no power in the company." Robert looked at her with an intensity that made Elena shiver. "You're much more than a lawyer. You're my daughter, and you're one of the few people who can make others listen. You have contacts, influence, and most of all, you have access to the truth." He took a step closer, extending a hand as if trying to reach her. "I need you to join us. I need you to help me expose Alexander's lies to the board and to the shareholders." Elena stepped back, biting her lower lip nervously. Her eyes were filled with doubt and pain. "Us? Who else is with you?" "Laura Fernandez, the HR director. John Perez has joined too. We're gathering evidence, but we need something more. Something only you can get." Elena frowned. "And what would that be?" Robert took a deep breath. "We need someone who can rally the loyal shareholders and call for an emergency board meeting. Someone who has credibility. If we can expose what Alexander and William have been doing, we'll have a chance to reclaim the company. But we need a lawyer who can articulate the case and present the evidence convincingly." "And what makes me think this isn't just another trap?" Elena whispered, pain filling her eyes. "What makes me think I'm not wasting my time with a man who just couldn't accept his defeat?" Robert felt his strength waning, but he forced himself to stand firm. "Nothing can guarantee that, Elena. But look at me. Do you really think I'm doing this out of pride?" He gestured to his worn clothes and the cap he used to hide his face. "I've worked as a cleaner for months just to see firsthand what they're doing to my company. I've spent endless nights mopping the very halls I once walked through with my head held high. If this were about pride," he shook his head slowly, "I wouldn't have come this far." Elena looked at him silently, her eyes searching for the truth in her father's. Finally, she sighed and pushed a stray strand of hair away from her face, her expression softening slightly. "Dad," she murmured, her voice gentle for the first time. "I don't know if I can trust you, but if there's even a small chance that what you're saying is true, I can't just stand by and do nothing." Robert felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. "Then, will you help me?" Elena stayed silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yes, I'll help you. But on one condition. If I find out that this is just another way for you to cling to a lost dream, I'll walk away forever. Robert stepped forward gently, reaching out to place a soft hand on her shoulder. I understand. I won't fail you again, Elena. I promise. She looked at him for a moment longer, then, with a sigh, let her defenses drop. For the first time in a long while, she saw in her father's eyes the reflection of the strong, honorable man she remembered. And in that small gesture, something broke between them, leaving room for a fragile yet genuine reconciliation. All right, Dad. Let's save this company. Together. And that night, in the quiet of the park, a father and his daughter reconnected, not as the strangers they had become, but as allies with a common purpose, to reclaim what was theirs. The lights in the main boardroom of Collins and Associates illuminated the large oval table around which the company's top shareholders and board members sat. The atmosphere was thick with tension and anticipation, like a powder keg about to explode. Robert watched from a dark corner of the room, dressed in his janitor's uniform and hidden among the shadows. Next to him, Laura, also disguised as part of the maintenance crew, kept her eyes fixed on the documents in her hands. This was the culmination of months of planning and sacrifice. Everything now depended on what happened in the next few hours. At the center of the table, Alexander Blake spoke with a firm and composed voice, projecting the same confidence he had always used to manipulate those around him. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see from the financial report for the last quarter, our company has reached unprecedented levels of profitability. He paused for a moment, letting them absorb the chart on the large screen behind him, which showed an apparently unstoppable rise in earnings. Thanks to the strategic decisions I've implemented, we're in a unique position to expand into new markets. But to do so, we need to take more aggressive measures. I propose selling off some of our less profitable patents and using that capital to acquire new international assets. There were murmurs of approval and nods among the attendees. Alexander smiled, savoring the feeling of total control. It was clear that he had most of the shareholders under his sway, manipulating their expectations with inflated figures and promises of future gains. Robert clenched his fists, feeling the rage and helplessness swell inside him. But he had to wait. The right moment would come soon. Just then, the boardroom doors burst open and all the murmurs fell silent. Elena Collins walked in with a determined stride, dressed in a sleek black suit. The attendees were stunned into silence, surprised to see the daughter of the company's former founder. Alexander frowned, but quickly regained his composure, flashing a smile filled with false cordiality. "Elena, what a surprise," he said smoothly. "I wasn't expecting you. What can I do for you?" Elena walked to the center of the room and turned to face the shareholders, completely ignoring Alexander. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today because there's something you need to know before making any decisions based on Alexander's proposals," she said firmly, her voice ringing clear and strong. "Over the past few months, this company has been manipulated from the inside. The numbers you're seeing in these reports are doctored. The decisions that have been made have benefited a small group, while the true value of our company has been secretly gutted." Murmurs erupted immediately. Alexander shot to his feet. "That's absurd," he exclaimed, trying to laugh it off. "Elena, what are you basing these accusations on? Everything I've done has been for the good of the company, and our numbers speak for themselves." Elena looked at him with icy calm. "The numbers do speak, Alexander, if you know how to listen." She turned towards the door and gestured for Laura and Robert to enter the room. The sight of Robert, even dressed as a simple janitor, caused an immediate stir. The faces of the shareholders shifted from surprise to confusion and then to disbelief. Alexander went pale and took a step back. "What the hell is this?" Alexander roared, pointing at Robert. "You have no right to be here." "Oh yes, he does," interjected John Perez, standing up from his seat at the far end of the table. He seemed to have regained his old dignity, and his voice rang out strongly. "Robert Collins is the true owner of this company, and we're here to show you the truth he's been hiding." "Truth?" Alexander spat, his eyes blazing with fury. "What charade have you brought here, Robert? You're just an old man who didn't know when to quit." "It's not a charade, Alexander." Robert's voice was calm, but every word was as sharp as a blade. "It's a reckoning." Elena activated the projector, and the screen filled with documents and emails that William had sent to various financial intermediaries abroad. The emails detailed secret deals to sell the company's patents at absurdly low prices, with massive sums of money diverted into personal accounts for William and Alexander in offshore tax havens. This can't be," Alexander muttered, stumbling backward as the evidence scrolled across the screen, the shareholders' eyes wide with shock. "These are fake. They're forged." "No, Alexander." Elena's gaze didn't waver. "They're real. These were compiled by several trusted employees who were tired of your tyranny and corruption." "This is a conspiracy!" Alexander screamed, desperate. "You can't do this to me!" William, who had remained silent in the corner of the room until now, stood up slowly. All eyes turned to him, and a deadly silence settled in the room. "Alexander," William said, his voice tense, "I think it's time for you to shut up." Alexander turned to him, incredulous. "What? You too? Traitor?" "No." William pulled a small device out of his pocket and placed it on the table. The screen on the projector shifted, displaying more documents, this time signed solely by Alexander. Evidence of bank transfers, forged signatures, and contracts with competing companies to sell off critical assets. "All of this is your doing, Alexander. You thought you could manipulate me, use me as your puppet, but you forgot one thing." William looked at him with a malicious smile. "I don't go down with sinking ships." Chaos erupted in the room. Shareholders began shouting, demanding explanations. Some stood up, pointing fingers at Alexander and calling for his immediate removal. Alexander tried to speak, but his words were drowned out by the cacophony of accusations and legal threats. Robert slowly stepped forward into the center of the room, watching as the man who had betrayed him crumbled under the weight of his own treachery. With each word from William, with each new piece of evidence revealed, Alexander shrank a little more, like a house of cards collapsing in front of everyone. Finally, when the boardroom seemed on the verge of exploding, Robert raised his hand, and silence fell. "Alexander Blake," he said gravely, "for years I considered you not just a partner, but a friend. But today, in front of all those who once believed in you, I declare you for what you truly are, a traitor. You have plundered the company we built together. You have betrayed everyone who trusted you. And now, you will face the consequences." Alexander looked around in panic, but there were no allies left, no one to turn to. "No, you can't do this to me. I'm the one who kept this company afloat." "You're the one who ruined it," Robert replied calmly, "and justice will come for you, as it should." With one last roar of rage, Alexander tried to storm out of the room, but at that moment, the doors swung open and 2 police officers entered, escorted by Elena. "Alexander Blake," one of the officers said, stepping forward, "you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud Collins and Associates." Alexander's face crumpled as the officers cuffed his wrists. The shareholders watched in stunned silence as the man who had once controlled everything was led out of the room, defeated and humiliated. Robert took a deep breath and looked around. They had won. But the real battle was just beginning. Rebuilding the company would be a long and arduous process. But this time, he would do it with the support of his daughter and his true allies. With Alexander out of the game, the era of darkness had come to an end. It was time to rebuild. The days following Alexander Blake's arrest were a whirlwind of changes and revelations. The media flooded the headlines with news about the financial scandal at Collins and Associates. The company's stocks plummeted, and the trust of clients and employees hit rock bottom. But for Robert, this was only the first step toward redemption. Now that Alexander was gone and William had been suspended pending investigation, Robert had to face the most difficult task: rebuilding the company from its foundations and restoring the faith of those who had lost all hope. Elena, with her charisma and legal expertise, became the new face of the resistance. Thanks to her efforts, the main shareholders convened to establish an emergency committee and propose radical changes in management. But to everyone's surprise, when they offered Robert leadership, he took a step back. "I didn't come here to reclaim control," he said before the board, his voice firm but serene. "My time has passed. This company needs new leadership, a new vision that respects our values but can also adapt to modern times." Murmurs filled the room. Many had expected Robert to reclaim his position, but instead, he turned to Elena with a proud smile. "I propose my daughter, Elena Collins, as the new Chief Executive Officer of Collins and Associates. She has the strength, intelligence, and integrity that this company needs to recover." Elena's mouth fell open. She hadn't anticipated this. She had thought her role would be limited to supporting her father from behind the scenes, but now he was passing the torch to her. The shareholders exchanged glances, nodding slowly. Despite her youth, Elena had demonstrated a bravery and determination that no one else possessed. "I accept," she finally said, her voice steady as she rose from her seat. "But with one condition: the company must return to its roots, to the values my father founded it on. It's not just about numbers, it's about the people. We will restore the trust of our employees and the community." Applause filled the room as Elena assumed her new role. Robert felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had spent years fighting to save his legacy, but now he understood that his true legacy wasn't the company itself. It was the strength and courage he had instilled in his daughter. In the weeks that followed, Elena threw herself fully into her new role, reforming company policies and reinstating programs that Alexander had dismantled. One of her first decisions was to rehire all the employees who had been unjustly fired and compensate them for their losses. The mass layoffs and toxic work environment gave way to a renewed spirit of camaraderie and collaboration. Robert watched her with pride from a distance. Now, his place was not in the offices, but in the hallways and break rooms, where he listened to the employees, offering support and hope. He was once again the Robert of the early days, the man who walked among his people, sharing their stories and concerns. Only this time, he did so as Javier, the humble janitor everyone knew but never truly noticed. One afternoon, as Robert strolled through the ground floor hallways, a familiar face appeared around the corner. John Perez stopped when he saw him, and the two men exchanged a long look. "Robert," John murmured, breaking the silence, "I want to thank you for not exposing me, for giving me a second chance." His eyes were filled with regret and at the same time with resolve. "All this time I felt like a coward, but you never gave up on me." Robert smiled and nodded. "I always knew your heart was in the right place, John, and what you did in the end, standing up to Alexander, proved to me that the man I once called a friend was still there, fighting to come out." John looked down, moved, and then raised his head with renewed determination. "I want to earn your trust back, and I want to help Elena fix what's been broken here." "You're already doing that, John. What matters now is that we move forward, side by side." They shook hands, a silent gesture of reconciliation. It wasn't just the end of a betrayal, but the beginning of a new alliance, one built on truth and redemption. And 3 months later, Collins and Associates began to rise from its ashes. News of the company's renewal spread quickly, attracting old clients and new investors who believed in Elena's vision. The employees, once demoralized and oppressed, returned to work with a renewed enthusiasm. But the biggest change came from within. Elena implemented a special program called Heard Voices, which allowed every employee, from the lowest level to the executives, to have a say in the company's decisions. Monthly roundtables were organized, and every comment, suggestion, and concern was taken seriously. This not only helped repair damaged relationships, but also generated a sense of belonging that the company had long lost. One day, during one of these meetings, a maintenance worker timidly raised his hand. It was Carlos Mendoza, the young employee who had supported Robert during his infiltration. "I want to thank the new management," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "When everything was falling apart, there were people working in the shadows, fighting to protect us, even when they didn't have to." His eyes met Robert's briefly, who stood at the back of the room, pretending to clean a corner. Elena smiled, understanding who he was referring to, and nodded. "Thank you, Carlos. Today, I want to acknowledge all those silent voices who helped Collins and Associates recover, and I also want to give a special thanks to someone very important." The murmurs in the room grew as everyone looked at Elena with curiosity. She stood up and looked directly at Robert. "Dad," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Come here." Robert's eyes widened. The entire room turned to face him as he let the rag he was holding drop. Elena stepped forward and, with a gentle smile, took his hand and led him to the center of the room. "This man is not just my father. He is the true hero behind all of this. He sacrificed his name, his position, and his dignity to save this company from the shadows. And now that it's over, I want everyone to know who he really is." Robert looked at his daughter, his eyes brimming with tears. "No, this wasn't necessary." "Yes, it was, Dad," Elena responded softly but firmly. "People need to know who you are and what you did. You are the true founder of Collins and Associates, and today we thank you for never giving up." The entire room erupted in applause. Robert felt an indescribable warmth fill his chest as all the faces around him lit up with genuine smiles and respect. For the first time in a long while, he was no longer a man hiding, no longer an invisible cleaner. He was Robert Collins, the man who had reclaimed his legacy, not with power or vengeance, but with patience, courage, and love. Elena handed him a commemorative plaque that read, "To Robert Collins, founder, defender, and silent hero. Thank you for restoring the spirit of this company." Robert accepted it with trembling hands and with a broken voice addressed the crowd. "I am not a hero," he said humbly. "I'm just a man who wanted to do what was right. But all of you, you are the real pillars of this company. You are the ones who make it all worthwhile. Thank you for not giving up." The applause that followed was deafening, and for the first time since his struggle began, Robert felt that he had found peace. They had won. Collins and Associates had been reborn. And that brings us to the end of this incredible story. If you enjoyed it and want more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss any of our future stories full of emotions and unexpected twists. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video, where we'll once again uncover the truth that always comes to light.